respirable aluminium dust or McIntyre powder would cure, prevent and treat silicosis. None of these claims would hold up to any sort of, they were not sensible claims, and they're also against a body of increasing international literature that didn't support those claims. Nevertheless, the Western Australian mining industry introduced aluminium dust as a treatment for silicosis in 1950, and miners inhaled it when they went underground. And I want to say that the West Australian miners were not necessarily compliant guinea pigs, and I'll show that when I give the talk. Before I go on, I want to explain for those of you who don't understand what silicosis is. Silicosis is not a curable disease, it's not treatable. It's caused by the inhalation of quartz dust, certainly in gold miners underground. And miners described it as building tombstones in their chest. So their lungs became inflamed and and basically solid, and they died a terrible respiratory death. And most miners expected to die of silicosis or silicosis and tuberculosis. So the next slide, it shows Western Australia began examining miners in 1925 for tuberculosis in order to give them compensation in 1932. And you can see the blue line is silicosis, and you can see that tuberculosis, which is the red line, it's tuberculosis and silicosis. Is that working? Okay. In 1950, when they began to introduce aluminium therapy, it had no effect on silicosis rates, and miners with silicosis were 5 times more likely to die of tuberculosis. This is just to show that I'm not the only Australian to come here. You can see that in 1897, one of those miners who was examined there came to the Klondike Gold Rush, having been to the Western Australian Gold Rush. And he goes on to die of silicosis and tuberculosis, possibly because he didn't have the McIntyre powder, or inevitably anyway. So in 1938, this was the understanding, or the basis, or the reason that they decided to, the rationale for treating tuberculosis with aluminium dust. It entered the lungs, it coated the silica particles with aluminium oxide, which prevented them from doing their deadly work, and it stayed on inside the lung. Now that was not true at all, but nevertheless the McIntyre Foundation was a powerful body that sent its envoys out all over the world, and Western Australia has the dubious distinction, apart from Mexico, Canada and I think the Belgian Congo, of introducing this mad treatment. We sent somebody to Canada to investigate the dust in 1946, and they said that it was possible that it could be used in Western Australian miners, but it should be a single measurable dose, it should be voluntary rather than compulsory, and that it shouldn't be given to people with tuberculosis, and it should be given under medical supervision. But no doctors were agreeable to supervising it. The national and state views of all physicians in Australia, particularly the TB physicians in 1948, they were absolutely unconvinced by the evidence that it would cure the disease, and the improvement was subjective only, so psychological. They were convinced by the McIntyre Foundation that it was going to cure them. There were various studies throughout the 40s, but none of them had a controlled trial, so they really weren't particularly in evidence, but they sort of thought that it didn't do any harm. Nevertheless, the Mineral Resources Bureau, which is the big body, the industry bureau, it has a lot of money, it was the most expensive, most powerful industry body in Australia, it decided that it would bring pressure to bear and cause all of the medical opposition to be discounted or disregarded. And it would speak to the government, and in 1948 the government legislated that all miners should inhale aluminium dust on their way underground as a compulsory measure. Now the industry introduced it, why? I think to save on compensation costs, to save on instituting proper dust control to actually prevent the disease. They were to maximise their profits which is their main reason for everything, really. In 1950, at the International Labour Organisation in Sydney at the pneumoconiosis conference, they said there was absolutely no conclusive evidence that it prevented silicosis, but they couldn't see that it was harmful to humans. In 1956, the Medical Research Council in Staffordshire and Trent, they were a randomised controlled study of 120 patients, and they said there was no evidence that it was useful, and that was published in a reputable journal and peer-reviewed. Nevertheless, disregarding all of that evidence, the Western Australian mining industry decided to introduce it underground. They introduced it with the support of the Australian Workers' Union, and those initials also stand for Australia's Worst Union, because they had no care for their workers, and they were happy to get sixpence extra dust money rather than proper dust control. And this, hopefully this works. This is a miner talking about having it and the reasons why he had it. Oh, sorry, you might have to.
Had it at Bullfinch, at the Copperhead.
Yeah.
And I think there was a lot of resistance to it from the miners. There was, because they had a room, you get into your work clothes, and then you had to go through this room, and I forget the amount of time that you had to sit in there and breathe this aluminium vapour, or aluminium dust. And the idea was to coat your lungs, and the cords of dust wouldn't stick to your lungs. But on a lot of the miners there, they walked straight through, wouldn't stop. And I thought, well, it's supposed to be good for you. The old man's got silicosis, so I'll go along with it. And and it must have coated your airways, because afterwards you sort of, when you coughed, your phlegm would be black stained through it from the aluminium.
So you had it yourself?
Yes. And maybe that's why I'm losing my memory.
And it was not cheap. Australia asked the McIntyre Foundation whether it could publish its, make its own dust, but the McIntyre Foundation said only its magical dust would work, nothing else. Already by 1952, so that's 2 years after it began, Australian miners decided that really they weren't going to have it. And this is a fairly succinct analysis by the miners of his view of this Canadian dust, and no reflection to Canadians here.
As far as I'm concerned, I've been on this mine for 30 years. I've sucked enough shit into my lungs without deliberately sucking someone else's, some Canadian bloody shit inside. He said I would change in there, and a lot of other blokes said, well, that's fair enough for me, and they went and changed on the surface.
So in 1960s, the industry decided to have a ballot, and in fact the heads of the industry said that they had never had this treatment. And they took a ballot and decided they would not, because so few men were staying in for the required time, that they were going to do away with it. That didn't satisfy the McIntyre Foundation, which had been insisting on reports being sent to them. They had visited Australia. And so that Dr. Shephers wrote to Australia, and he said, look, you should continue the dust, and there can be no objection to these conscientious objectors, since these shirkers would develop silica and probably die from it. And they would form a very good control group. And actually it wasn't a control group, it was a comparison group. So Shephers was a complete idiot, really, and quite unscientific, but he was a very good salesman. That didn't convince the Australian government, and by this time, or the West Australian government, by this time, the medical doctors had taken over control of miners' health. And before 1963, rates of silicosis weren't correlated with dust control, but they were in 1963, and the industry stopped being responsible for miners' health, so lucky for them. So Australia simply stopped having aluminium therapy, or aluminium dust treatment. It just disappeared, and there was no publication about it. But what is interesting is most of those files by the Mines Department have been destroyed. So it's very difficult to see what the department itself thought about the treatment. Now, I don't know whether it's been destroyed because they were worried about compensation costs from workers or not. It's unclear. Anyway, in 1967, the Health Department in Western Australia said it had never approved of this treatment, and it was against all principles of industrial hygiene, which are dust suppression and ventilation. So they'd said that from the beginning in 1948, and they continued to say it in 1967, but the McIntyre Foundation didn't give up, even though we'd stopped all the treatment, even though we'd told them repeatedly that it was rubbish and that we weren't going to continue. They still wrote to us in 1971 asking if we would reinstate the treatment, and the occupational health physician Don Lepham said that it was absolutely useless in the prevention of silicosis, and he hoped it would be the last time this old myth was resurrected. So here's a back of a miner's card, and you can see by AL that he had 5 years of aluminium therapy. Now, miners agreed or pretended that they'd had that in order to keep their compensation valid. They were worried that if they didn't say they had the dust, that they wouldn't be compensated for their disease. So it was just stamped on the back of their card. But apart from that, there was absolutely no medical examination or medical supervision of the treatment, because none of the West Australian doctors would be involved in it. So what I've just told you is a historical analysis of a treatment in Western Australia of aluminium dust given for the cure, prevention and prophylaxis of silicosis. And I think that I can, confidently say that it wasn't the magic dust promised by the McIntyre Foundation, but snake oil, really, by carpetbaggers from Canada.